One of the most interesting findings was by this economist, Raj Chetty. He studied 70 million Facebook users, and he looked at what led to economic mobility, put everything in the hopper, very sophisticated methods, and he only got one significant finding. But the significant finding he got was radical and illuminating for a lot of people who are puzzling about these issues. He found out that when people in the lowest SES, the lowest quartile wealth, if they had friends when they were, say, in high school with people in the highest SES, that was the only variable led to economic mobility across the whole model. These networks make a difference, and the absence of them can be a huge source of social inequality.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. David Obstfeld is an associate professor of management at Cal State Fullerton and an influential researcher focused on social networks, innovation, and the effects of social capital. During his time as a tenured professor with over 15 years of teaching experience, he noticed a troubling trend at universities. First-generation college students were struggling to secure job opportunities upon graduation, leaving them at a disadvantage compared to their peers. Research has revealed a clear link between access to social networks and student financial outcomes, with wealthier students gaining social capital that propelled their career success above those around them. It wasn't what they knew, it was who. This insight led David to establish the Social Capital Academy, an initiative to help underrepresented students build the social and cultural capital they need to succeed. Through mentoring, networking, and skill-building workshops, David is altering the trajectory of students' careers and helping bridge the gap in economic opportunity. His latest book, Getting New Things Done: Networks, Brokerage, and the Assembly of Innovative Action, also examines how networks and brokerage drive creativity and organizational innovation. In this episode, David and I talk about the evolution of network analysis, social networks and the role of social capital, and why getting new things done drives company success. We also discuss the role of brokers and triads, which means groups of three actors, in social networks, whether social skills are innate or developed, perspective articulation, scalable models that build social capital for underserved groups, and other topics. If you learned something from today's episode, be sure to subscribe to continue supporting Work for Humans and to not miss the next episode. So without further ado, please enjoy this insightful conversation with David Obstfeld. David Obstfeld, welcome to Work for Humans.
It's a pleasure to be here, Dart.
I've always doubted a lot of the network analysis that I've seen in companies, and I will tell you why. It's often somebody who's gotten access to data about who's connected to whom in emails or in meetings, and they found a way to display it, which is very pretty. First of all, I wasn't sure it was the right data. In other words, is it really meaningful to know who's in what meeting with whom? I never knew what decisions we were going to base it on. What decisions were we actually going to make based upon these data? But when I read your book, Getting New Things Done, I saw network analysis in a completely new way, and in a way that was incredibly relatable to me. In fact, I felt like I was reading a book by scientists who study mice, and I'm the mouse. Like, this is my life, what you've described in network analysis. So really excited to talk to you about it. Can we just start by framing, because not everybody's looked at network analysis, and I didn't know the history of it before. What is the history of network analysis? Where does it come from?
So it's a great question. And as you no doubt would expect, it's a complicated question because there's different arenas that people study social networks, but I'll describe, say, maybe two. So there's this arena called social network analysis. And then there's another arena called social capital. And let's just say they both start from the assumption that people are shaped by their network. So yeah, but compared to what? Well, there's maybe more of a psychological orientation, or even just an idea that we're shaped by our motivation and our personality, and that's on the individual. But somewhere in the mix, as social scientists, we look at it and say, listen, we're embedded in a structure of ties, of networks, and they shape our action. This all started actually way back, maybe in the early 1900s. A famous old school sociologist by the name of Zimmel, wrote a really famous essay called The Triad. And he said, I have this intuition, the transition between dynamics of one or two radically changes when there's three or more. And he wrote this foundational essay on the dynamics of threes, which I'm sure we'll get into. That's really still even influenced my work today. There's other folks maybe worth mentioning that social network vein. This goes to that idea that a snapshot that everyone's maybe seen, it's like a photograph of a network and people are represented as little dots or circles and there's lines between them. That's actually originally called a sociogram. That was pioneered by a guy named Moreno in the 30s. And then other people in this tradition looking at the structure and how that shapes people. One famous contributor was a guy named Mark Granovetter, professor at Stanford. And he had this really unusual, initially counterintuitive insight that when he studied how people got jobs, didn't come from the people they knew the best, what he called strong ties. It came from people that they knew less well, or what he called weak ties. And people went scratching their chin, And the famous title for that article was The Strength of Weak Ties. And we can talk about why that might be true. It fit right into my work. But let's just call that one column of work around social network analysis. It got much more exotic as computers imposed their potentiality. So to study and run complex algorithms and understand who was positioned where. But then in this parallel field called social capital, let's just say it's the sum of resources you access through your network, ideas and information. There's another thread of work that goes back to France and Pierre Bourdieu. And then more recently, you could talk about Jacob's Top of the Death and Life of Cities. And then most recently, Bob Putnam at Harvard, who wrote a famous book, I guess in the 90s, called Bowling Alone. And what he noticed was that social capital as our shared access to resources in a society maybe has gone down because we don't socialize as much. And the title of the book, Bowling Alone, was a random observation from a bowling alley owner that said to him, you know what? We have probably the same volume of customers, but they don't participate in bowling leagues anymore. They come as individual bowlers. And Putnam was already thinking about this in Italy, the difference between North and South Italy, the culture. And he said, yeah, I think this is a thing. And he had the research to back it up, that on a social capital level, the resources and we access, the trust that we hold, that's gone down. And we're more atomistic and we're not as much operating in networks of support.
I hear two things in this. First of all, the initial shift was a foreground background shift, which is you can focus on the nodes and you can make it a psychology activity. And you can say, what are the attributes of the person that make them successful or not successful? And people just said, look, that's insufficient. There's a context that people are in, and it has to do with these ties to other people. And you can't understand the performance of individuals without actually looking at that.
Exactly right. I wouldn't say it any different.
And then the second thing is, other people started saying, yeah, and there's value to that we're going to call it capital. And it's an interesting thing to say that you have a stock, this idea that you have a stock of these connections that are not just utilitarian, but you could potentially measure their value. Was that the conversion to capital?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Now, social capital, the language of it has a long tradition and heritage, but the fundamental reason about this jargon you can trace and say, listen, very transparently, you and I, we have different stocks of financial capital. We could look at our checkbook and, our account at Schwab, whatever that might be. We know that metaphor. Then we could kind of stretch it a little bit and say we have human capital. So my students are in a university, they take classes, they're acquiring human capital. One of them may be a barista at Starbucks. They know how to make a cafe latte. That's a form of accumulated human capital. When we get to this language of how we accrue resources and opportunities through these networks, which you pointed out exactly correctly, you can't get the measure of the person without understanding not just their individual assets, but the structure in which they operate. How do we talk about this weird stuff about what accrues to a person by their network in which they're embedded? And that's where the social capital intuition came, and even the language itself, sort of in that capital tradition, but it's capital in the form of a social resource that you have. And also a resource you have on a social and a societal level as well. That was the Putnam stuff.
Oh, right. So the idea is that there is social capital, which I can have, which is my extended network potentially. But then you take a village and you look at the combined social capital across all of them, it can be a community resource.
Absolutely. We can go back to this. I mean, I'm sure, I don't know if we want to go there quite yet, but to say, you can look at different societies and the amount that they have a network where they can call on people for support, whether there's trust. And then you could say there's higher social capital in one milieu, maybe, and this is some of the interesting work by Putnam, you can trace that maybe over centuries in some cases. And by the way, can also evaporate. And I think one potential thing that we could talk about down line here is to say we've lost some social capital. The level of collaboration across boundaries, trust in dissimilar others as a society. This is not the focus of my research, but it's certainly something that we observe that we're in a little bit of a crisis with respect to that.
Let's get into the topic of your research, which is getting new things done. The argument you make at the beginning of the book is companies that exist today are the sum of their history of getting new things done. And their future is going to be the sum of the new things that they are able to get done. And so the whole story of a company can be that, and that it's tied to how the networks are functioning inside their organization. So what is the link between the networks, the structure of networks, and getting new things done?
Innovation, I argue in the book, is central to organizing. Now, to be clear, I think that's evolved in the direction of innovations more crucial than it ever was before. So go back 30 or 40 years, there probably was an innovation at the genesis of FedEx, for an example. There's an innovation, someone's traveling around, they have this idea of a different way to kind of move packages more efficiently as an augmentation or replacement to the post office. So an innovation was at the root of the creation of that organization. But generally going back 40 or 50 years, if organization carved out, and since before that, a pretty good position, innovation might not have been as much of a priority because they had a stable incumbent status. But now, because of all this infusion of technology, the rapid exchange of information along the rails of a flattened world, things happen a lot quicker. Innovation becomes a lot more important. And then if there is a DNA or a set of conditions that lead to the creation of innovation that has to do with networks, well, networks becomes really, really important, not just at an organizational level, but the people within your organization who have the capacity to innovate. And what I argue and actually gather empirical data to suggest is that certain kinds of network structures and network activity are definitely more valuable in creating innovation than others.
Okay, there's a couple things I want to establish, and then we'll get into the research. And one of the things is that this is very associated with the knowledge view of the firm. And there's a paper that I've been very influenced by, which is called Toward an Attention-Based View of the Firm. It's sort of like these papers that say, look, let's look through a lens of how knowledge flows or how attention flows. And so what is the knowledge view of the firm, and how does it tie into networks?
It's a really good question. I don't get this question often because it's a little more esoteric, but it's a credit to you, Dart, that you're reading closely. And so no doubt when you study management and organizations and how they compete, there's different viable frames for why one firm would have an advantage over another firm. And so there's different things you could point to, the structure of the industry. But I'd say about 30 years ago, a very influential frame of thinking came, which was called the knowledge-based view of the firm. It's still out there and still influential, but that's sort of when it came to the fore. And it basically said, you know what? Among the many other things that organizations need to draw on to compete successfully, knowledge is one of those things which is a very scarce and valuable resource. And so we want to hypothesize and then collect data to support the idea that firms that access better knowledge, superior knowledge, more timely knowledge, they can compete better. And this became a very influential field, and it's still true in terms of how we think about it. And I can give you a homespun example. So let's take an example of a firm that was adequately configured. We'll talk about Starbucks several decades ago, based in Seattle, 3 or 4 stores. And then Howard Schultz. And by the way, let's just be clear. Howard Schultz was not the founder of Starbucks. He stumbled onto it, was quite taken by it. He left a job in New York and he came to work for them in a marketing capacity. What's interesting to note here is that Starbucks at that point, with great pride and skill, sold roasted bags of coffee. I guess roasted or either ground or unground. And so that's what they did. They did it quite well. And they were quite an early stage startup with some support. Okay, so Schultz is very excited about this firm, leaves his job. And then completely unrelated to that job, he goes to some conference in Italy. He's in Milan. And he, quite on a lark, just stumbles into an espresso bar. And he has a revelation. He sees things associated with coffee, which is where he's based, but never seen and thought about before. Goes into anyone who's been to Italy has seen this in action. People walking up to the bar, getting an espresso, taking a shot and leave. That's one scenario. Another scenario is people really hanging out at the other part of the bar. And there's this big social context, like this is the place where people hang out. What will sort of come to be described in, I'm sure you're familiar with this literature, a third place, not business, not home, but a place where people socialize. So he sees these drinks. He sees things like people are saying cafe latte. They're seeing espresso. So he's seeing this idea of a profitable way of engaging the coffee context by serving drinks, very different than what he saw in the US. He's also seeing that social context. Okay, so he brings that back to Starbucks in Seattle. Now, what I'm going to argue on the knowledge-based view of the firm is that Starbucks was bequeathed a certain base of knowledge about how to roast coffees and sell it by the bag. Schultz acts as a broker. We haven't discussed this yet, but he's a broker. He's between. Yes, he works for Starbucks, but he's going to Italy. He's seen something different. He's seen what we're going to call knowledge, new knowledge about how coffee can be used and sold, and he brings it back to Starbucks. And so you can see how if they make use of that knowledge and they know how to make use of, these are all things that strategy people think about. They got the ideas, but they didn't know how to harvest them. You know, it's like Xerox PARC back in the day had the mouse. They didn't know how to use it. Steve Jobs stumbled in and said, you have no idea. And he took that mouse and he made it part of one of the original laptops. But back to Schultz. I just want to sort of finish his story to say, I want to be clear so we don't get too Pollyannish about this. When Schultz came back, they did not treat him like the conquering hero. They gave him a little bit of a license to put with 100 square feet, a little bit of a barista here and something here, but they didn't really buy in. And so much so that at some point he left Starbucks. He fully built it out. He had a lot of struggles to get enough resources to build it out, but then he finally proved it out. It became a chain by a different name. And with those resources, he came back and bought Starbucks. So you can have a broker bringing back super advantageous knowledge, but this is maybe for any listener who says, you don't need me to tell them that, but you can bring great ideas. Doesn't mean that they're going to be celebrated. And this is exactly what did happen at Starbucks. It wasn't celebrated. He left, he came back, but ultimately on the rails of knowledge, this new knowledge that came from Milan, figuring out how to use it. So baristas, no more bow ties for the baristas like they had in Milan, no more classical music, maybe more hip music. He made these adjustments to the model, but still it was in a knowledge-based view, this importation, this importing of new knowledge that made Starbucks vastly more competitive.
On this show, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company builds and delivers to employees. This struck a nerve. Work for Humans is in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. And along the way, people began to approach us, asking us how they could put multi-sided management into practice. And they were from all walks of business, line managers and CEOs, 3-person startups and multinationals and universities. But they all shared in common the belief that management practices of the last century are clearly not working. In response to this demand, I've pulled together a small team of some of the best people I have ever had the privilege to work with during my long career, who are also passionate about multi-sided management. And we formed a company, 11-fold, to serve the need. If you want your employees to feel more alive at work, you want happier teams, lower turnover, and you want tools that traditional management failed to give you to balance the needs of the company and the needs of your teams, let's talk. Employees give your company value it cannot survive without. When you fail to design great work, they will unsubscribe, either by leaving or even worse, by losing the ability to care. Join us at 11fold.com, spelled 11FOLD. Let's change management. So now let's talk about the network structure. And I know a large part of your book is saying that network structure is not enough. It's not enough just to talk about the structure. We need to talk about the process. But let's talk for a second about structure. there's a terminology that goes with triads. There's two alters and there's a broker. And the broker acts between the two alters. And there's also this idea that sometimes there's a hole, which is that the two alters, the two parts that are going to be connected by the broker, may not be aware of each other. And a part of what the broker is doing is spanning that gap. So I want to talk about the different kinds of brokers. There's conduits, there's tertius gaudens, and there's tertius jungens.
I guess I have to say to listeners, Dart, you're stealing from my pretentious esoteric language. And I will go there because I rarely get that question. So it's kind of fun to get it in those terms. But before I go there, we'll call that process. But let's just take a step back and say, let's talk about what a broker is. I mentioned that Schultz was the broker. What made him a broker? A broker is simply in between, in this most minimal thing, a broker's between two other people. They're a person in the middle. So you can even think, what's a real estate broker? At the end of the day, that name came from, they stand between buyers and sellers and they bring them together. And, there's could be let's just say two different kinds of triads, which is that minimal viable frame to understand all the dynamics that people would need to know in a bigger picture. And this will make sense. But there could be an open or a closed network in a game of threes. There could be a closed network, and I'm in the middle between two people who know each other. It's called a closed triad, closed network. It's often called a dense network if everyone knows each other. And then there can be an open triad where I'm tied to two other people. They don't know each other. And I want to make a distinction between these two because I think it can be useful for listeners to say they both have strengths and weaknesses. So a closed triad, everyone knows each other, efficient exchange of information, typically much higher trust, but maybe not so many new ideas because everyone kind of knows the same thing, kind of like an echo chamber. So what I say about a closed triad and anything that resembles that in a larger social space, it has an idea problem because they're not sourcing new information or knowledge, but it has an action advantage because if I want to get those 3 or 5 people who all know each other to move together, we kind of know each other and we know how to act and know how to appeal to them. And there's a lot of trust and we'll move. Now let's talk about that open triad. It has the opposite signature. I'm probably sourcing more novel information. That person over here is an artist. The person over here is involved in corporate world operations and supply chain. They don't know each other. I'm sourcing entirely new information about what's happening in some artistic realm. And over here, I'm sourcing new knowledge that's happening in some businessy Fortune 50-ish realm. And so in that open triad, and this is just the simplest version, I'm sourcing new knowledge. So in that structure, open triad, I have an idea advantage, no question, but I have an action problem. If I have a network with a bunch of people who don't know each other and I say, hey, want to do a startup, come join me. By definition, they don't know each other. They may have different values and objectives and interests. So that's the structural point that happens in triads.
And what was interesting is that Howard Schultz, in the Starbucks example, was an open triad. He was taking ideas from a far-flung situation, trying to bring them in, and it was a bridge too far initially.
Absolutely, but he did source new, potentially valuable information. Nothing, when he walked into the espresso bar in Milan, there was no banner that lit up and said, big advantage here. He had to discover it. This is all stuff that people who are interested in these issues of knowledge. How do people find things? How do they carve it out? How do they translate it? These are all these dynamics that he had to go through. And so I want to go to that other question you asked, but I just want to say for anyone who's tracking this, the question they might ask themselves, and I ask my students, whether they're undergrads or MBAs, is what do you think the structure of your network might be? And I would say for my undergraduates in general, because I have a regional university, they're more closer to where they originated and they may know all the same people from high school. And even when I talk to MBAs at top universities, you should puzzle on whether you have that open network sufficiently open. In general, earlier in career, I'd say the risk to watch is your network is too closed. It doesn't have enough novelty. You don't know enough people. And so there's a real advantage going out to meet new people. But so that's just this distinction between open and closed triads. And by the way, Zimmel in the early 1900s saw all of this. I mean, he was talking about this dynamics back in the day. But now I want to get, if it's okay, to that question you asked about these processes. So if we talk about Schultz as the first example, I'm going to say that Schultz acted as a broker, open network, like you pointed out, but he served a particular role at that moment. He was what I'm going to call one of three possible processes that go with the triad. He was a conduit. He went to Milan. He found knowledge. He brought it back to Starbucks. Now, he still had an interest and stake in that, but that's a scenario as well. I have a new idea. I give it to you, Dart. I say, good luck, go forth and prosper. And we don't talk about that again. But in general, a conduit is a person who goes to some other space, finds new knowledge, different country, different organization, goes to a conference, finds stuff, brings it back, could be different divisions within the corporation. That's number one. The next two you mentioned was tertius gaudens, which is fancy Latin for the third who enjoys. Zimmel originally wrote about this in the 1900s. It's a Latin term that means the third who enjoys. And it's this idea that people in the middle can play those other two people off one another. Or you could imagine a woman who has two suitors and she says, well, he took me for dinner. What are you going to do for me? That's the tertius gaudens behavior, but that can happen in a business context. And then the third, because the predominant view about what lurked beneath social network structure we were talking about was this is what brokers did all day. This is how they secured advantage. They played people off one another. And when I went into the field and studied automotive design, I found something very different. And I found that people who connected people, and this is intuitively probably obvious to your listeners, but to kind of formalize it in a way that's useful and they can think about, is that people who connected people were crucially involved in innovation. So that other Latin term, I coined that to sort of match Simmel's ancient terminology. It was called tertius young gains. Young gains is Latin for to connect. Another word that comes from that is yoga. Yoga means the connection to God. So that connecting piece is coined into that Jungian's phrase. But if it's okay, can I tell you from my field work how I kind of stumbled into that distinction?
Yeah, that would be fantastic. I will tell you, I love words. I love words that describe something in the world that I've seen, and now I can think about it differently. And it even made me think about Shakespeare. It made me think about the character Iago, who's a totally tertius gaudens. He's profiting off of the division between Othello and, starts with a D, I can't remember her name. But anyway, he's creating separation and he's profiting off of it.
I can't lose the track on this because I'm so interested and I'm so excited about networks. But I want to do a brief digression for a second because I look at knowledge and networks. So we've been talking about networks. Knowledge is a really important puzzle. And you and I, Dart, we both, and I imagine most of your listeners love words. But then the issue is, who is your audience? And so for a certain audience, diving into tertius young gains could make them roll their eyes and you could literally lose them. So you always, as part of the crucible of action, which is advocating innovation, reading a room and making translations so it's not too complex, not too simple. It's just Goldilocks, just right. And we can come back to that process that accompanies the network stuff.
We will, because we're going to get into the social part later. And I think that's a part of what you're talking about.
Okay, so where did this come through? So I studied automotive design in Detroit. And by that, I mean, I went to Detroit every morning at 6 or 7 a.m. And I watched the design of an automobile for a not to be named automotive company. And I watched the design of an entirely new build. So it wasn't just a refresh, and identified 75 innovations on the platform. And as a field observer, I went very deep into several of those processes. And I started to see, I'm very aware of my literature talking about brokers are important. And I certainly saw the evidence about that. A lot being written about people who could play people one another, keep ideas separate. I certainly saw evidence for that. But the signature of making innovation happen in complex ways was how people at the critical time could bring people together. And so one of my main informants who I watched quite closely was over the entire platform, advocated for an innovation. He knew that the prototyping process really was terrible. It didn't have the latest technology. It was very costly. It was very slow. He needed to advocate. And so he took stock of his network, and he knew that there were senior people in the organization that understood essentially where he was headed and had his back. And there were others that were skeptical and potentially others that he knew would be opposed. And so he very strategically sequenced what he did. And he first went to those people that he knew that would be more favorable. He got more knowledge and input from them. And he brought them together in that tertius young gains connecting, we'll call it connecting orientation. And then as he created some momentum around that core, he brought other people that maybe were on the fringe of what he suspected would be potentially interested. And when he created more critical mass, he even brought more people in. So what was he doing? He was toggling between that connecting work and separating work. He wasn't naively thinking, I'm going to go to a big meeting, tell everyone at one time. And the core idea is that I need to bring this core group of people together and build support for overall. But he went about it very strategically. I saw another group advocate for an innovation where they kept everything under wraps till they built critical mass. And they brought a whole collection of people together for a big meeting, but they had people at different parts of the room that they knew who they were. And at selective times, they called on them for their input. And Dart, you're nodding because you're in the corporate world as well. We've both been there. We know. So what's happening here is I'm saying there's structure, open versus closed. And then there's these three behaviors: conduit, connecting, and separating. And the skillful advocate for innovation is toggling between all three, knowing how to stage it. And the example I use is one of like a dinner party. And I'll sort of maybe end up here for now and say, listen, if we're at home and we're talking to our wife or a partner or a friend, say, let's throw a dinner party. We walk into the dining room. We say, okay, here's the table. There's 12 seats. And we start to think, who might we invite to create the best possible dinner party? Well, we have 12 seats, so we can't invite everybody we know. And we probably going to have some kind of a theme. And we might want 6 of those seats allocated to very committed couples and maybe a couple singles that may or may not want to meet each other, things of that nature. By definition, the core theme of what we're doing is connecting. We're creating something where nothing existed before. That should not be lost on anyone listening. But at the same time, there's some people I'm not going to invite to that dinner party. I'm simply not, because they're not a fit or I have limited the number of seats in the dinner table. So being a good host and creating a good dinner party is almost defined by my ability to do the connecting work appropriately on the edge, do the separating work and not invite the people that are not going to be as big a match. And being able to connect those two is the essence of creating a good dinner party. And I'll add to that, creating a good startup. They're not so different.
There are things that I learned in what you just said that I did not understand before, because I will say I was thinking of these different ways of acting in a network as types of people or business roles. Like there might be a real estate broker who benefits from the fact that there's a distance between the buyer and the seller or something like that. But no, they're more like tactics and strategies. They are things that you apply intelligently in the context to get things to happen, to make things happen. It's subtler and I like it. It's useful.
Well, that's the highest praise you can give me, to come up with ideas that are useful in the world. Let's just say that there are issues where, at least nominally, your role could be to bring people together. There's implicit brokerage involved in what you do as a podcaster. You're going to be a good podcaster on some level if you facilitate good conversations, but you're also a broker between all the potential people who could participate in this podcast and the ones that you deem are most interesting to your audience, and then bringing them in and facilitating the best conversation. So people can have roles as brokers. They can have better organizational support to be brokers. And then also some can be better at it than others. Some have better orientation to be doing the connecting work than others. Now, to be clear, being a broker by itself, a person who's connected between different worlds, the research shows that just being that structural person with an open network, that they do better. They break information silos. They're more involved in innovation and creativity. They get faster promotions. They get higher pay. They're more involved in entrepreneurship success. If you have that open triad that links you to all these worlds, you often do better, is what the empirical work shows. But then you can't fully understand why a broker is doing better unless you bring in what's the process that surrounds us. And some people are more disposed to doing connecting work than others. And I'm going to argue, and we can go into this, that they're going to do better in many scenarios, in many contexts.
Now, one of the big differences between the structural approach to networks and the process approach that you're describing, the process approach seems a lot more dynamic. It's not assuming a fixed structure. Like when I think of the fixed structure, I think of it as like an electrical schematic. This is how this network is going to work. I want to bring up the role of social, I don't know if it's skills, but the social component of this. You quote Fligstein, who said social skills are the ability to induce cooperation. You're saying some people are better at this than others, and it seems like a lot of it might lie in that.
That's absolutely correct. Fligstein and McAdams are sociologists. They've studied social movements, a lot of different contexts, and I'm in complete agreement. They came up with a fairly lengthy list of the different kinds of behaviors, which is very much consistent with this emphasis on process as well as structure. Neither of those authors would ever say structure is not an issue. We all know that this is where we began the conversation. We all know that networks make a difference. But then if I'm going to be an activist, we'll say broadly defined, I'm going to pursue community change or innovation within a firm. It's very difficult to talk comprehensively and incisively without acknowledging the role of process. Now, there are a lot of things that you could point to. So one would be that ability to kind of know when to connect and when to keep people apart. Another could be this ability to how to frame opportunities. And this goes back to this idea of the knowledge view and this idea about how to articulate knowledge. When you watch actors, and I watched this quite closely in the field, you could just sense that there were certain people, when they had ideas, they knew how to articulate them for the audience at hand. And this goes back to your comment about this is interesting or relevant. I think knowledge articulation, we're trying to take something that people say, oh, yeah, of course, but we want to problematize and say, well, how you share information to someone, when you share it, how much detail you provide, knowing how to do that is a strategic skill. It's a social skill. And it's not too much, not too little. This is what we were talking about earlier. Your ability to translate. Details in one case may persuade an audience. You may cause you to lose another audience. And knowing how to read situations and then figure out who's in the room, that is a function of this idea of social skill. Can't have the complete story unless you look at the people who are the agents pursuing change, advocating for innovation without having some sense of their social skill.
One of the things that you describe is perspective articulation as a tool under social skill. Can you describe that?
If you're in conversation with someone and A, you have an implicit theory about what motivates them, or B, at the appropriate time, you can say, hey, Dart, I know what's most important to you is X, Y, Z. Let's take the first case. If I have a theory and it's accurate about why you're here and what potentially is our reason for collaborating, and maybe it's not a strong tie, maybe it's something that I know you change, or I've just met you, but I have a read on the situation. That's a facet of social skill. In key pieces, for me to be able to actually even articulate your position in a way that captures and says, yes, you get that. You may get what I'm interested in even more than I get it. This ability to say what other people are interested in, it can be a very powerful way to sort of create collaboration, to build trust, which again becomes the currency of the realm for how do you get to square 2, square 3, square 4 as we potentially work together.
I have to say, there's so many examples of this, and I need to describe a few of them. One of the things that I have had to do as a manager is represent the perspective of Group B to Group A a lot. And the reason is that Group A and Group B are oftentimes naturally fall into suspicion of each other. And the reason is they don't have a lot of information about what's going on over there, and so they sort of have doubts. And then Group B does something that's inexplicable, and Group A decides to ascribe nefarious motives to that. And so a part of what you have to do as a manager is you have to constantly explain to your team the perspective of others. Look, Group B is in a position where they're afraid. And they're afraid because of this. And because they're afraid, they're responding in this way. Because if they lose trust entirely, I can't get them to work together.
I love this example. It's so real world. And I want to give 2 variations on a theme. Scenario 1 is that you are actually in a meeting and you've been called to this meeting and saying, Dart, you stand between Department A and Department B. We both have worked with you. We trust you. And we can't figure this out. That's code for we're not getting along and I don't trust those sons of you know what. And so a meeting is called, you sit at the table and you are very mindful of what the interests of one or the other. And in ways that are, again, socially skilled, You may illuminate the concerns of group A to B, or just generally, but everyone hears them and legitimize them. And then you go and do something similar for group B. And in that sense, A gets a better feel for B, B gets a better feel for A. And they sort of, in those Venn diagrams, they see some overlapping piece. And the whole edge of distrust may dissipate somewhat, or if you're a miracle worker, completely. That's version one. Version two could be someone from Department B says, I'm dealing with A, and we're about to have this meeting, and I'm going to tell you why I don't trust those folks, and we're not going to get this done because here's what's wrong with them. And you say, well, hang on. Let me give you a different frame, because I know you, person from Department B, and I know what you're trying to create. I support you, so that there's trust between you. Let me tell you what I think is happening in A. There's a lot of uncertainty. You may not realize this, but their resources are in jeopardy. And they see this as kind of a critical, I'm making stuff up generically.
Exactly.
They see a critical issue here. And by the way, there's this one thing that happened you don't even know that leads them to believe this about B and other departments like B. And all of a sudden, B has a revelation. This is not about me. I'm not going to take it personally. This is not like an unbridgeable divide. There's dynamics. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do as a broker is simply illuminate that it's not about you. Here's the concern of that other group. And then you step away. You may not even be at that meeting in version two. But either way, it's the power of the broker to build trust and to build connection.
There's one person I've worked with a lot. His name is Alex Komorowski. One of the things that he does that I find so fascinating. So he's a product leader, and he product leads in a particularly challenging situation, which is that he's led platforms. So Chrome, as an example, or Google Maps. And the challenge with that is that you need to bring developers to the table, and you need to bring users to the table, and you need to create a platform that serves both. And many times the developers are all kicking each other under the table because they're competing with each other or something like that. So one of the things that he's done is he creates communities. And these are communities of people who are wildly diverse. And he has rules for what these communities are going to be. First of all, they are selective in who's going to be there. So he's doing that idea of we're going to create, he calls it sort of a membrane, which is that some people are going to be able to get in, and we're going to create ways to let them into this community, and others might not be able to be there. And that's Gauden's. So that's this idea of being aware of who you're going to exclude. And these groups for him become huge information gatherers, because one of the rules is that they should not be from the same organization. You don't want all the people in the same organization because it becomes an echo chamber. And so he's going to be very far flung, and he's going to bring wide people together that share in common the ability to have collaborative debate is one of the main ideas. And so that puts him in a position to have this gigantic listening post on the world. It's very much what you're talking about. It's kind of scaled up.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting example, because I think up until this point in our conversation, we've talked about individuals in their context, units. And so the puzzle could be, and I know you think in these terms, Dart, from an organizational level, how do you facilitate innovation and inclusion? And so without knowing all the details about Alex's work, he's creating a context at, let's just say, a senior level. It's more distributed. It's not like a formal hierarchy, obviously, but at a distributed level, he's basically saying, within this envelope of community that I'm authorizing and that I'm creating, I'm going to kind of raise the value proposition for functioning like a tertius young gains, for a connector. And I'm going to say, as one rule of operation, I want to really support that. And all of a sudden people say, listen, I'm very excited to be a part of this platform in this community. And I get that he's making it safe for me to share information that ordinarily or otherwise in other contexts, and maybe just like yesterday, I wouldn't share this information. But in this context, I see that if I share this information, there's a high enough level of trust and acknowledgement that this would be a safe space. And this is certainly what leaders can do. It's what managers can do when they hire new people or they come into a new division and there's new people coming in, and they have a role not only in terms of decision making, but creating envelopes where people engage and shape how they engage and whether they share information. You know, the dominant logic for being a connector, that tertius young gains idea, is in part because you can be in the middle to create something. But also it generates reciprocity. So if I'm in this kind of very fluid environment, it's moving quite quickly, but on average, I'm sharing more information and connecting people. What I'm engendering in a broad and distributed network is people's disposition to reciprocate and share information. Doesn't mean like I give you something today and tomorrow you say, listen, I owe you, buddy. Here's another introduction. It could happen that way. But in general, if I operate in that way, I'm building trust in my network and appreciation and reciprocity. So you go back to Alex, the head of that platform. If on a level of 50, 100, or 500 people, he's creating or tipping the scale more towards reciprocity and sharing, and sort of implicitly saying, we're going to play by this game and we're going to treat everyone with respect, he could potentially radically transform the generative nature, the creativity and the innovativeness of that platform over a sustained period of time.
And one of the things that is not obvious about the knowledge view of the firm, but you did mention in the book, which is recombinant ideas. Alex is very conscious of the idea that ideas combine to create new ideas. So things come together. And so you just said the word generative. And that's exactly what this is about. It's 1 + 1 does not equal 2 in this. It equals 3. There's interest on the combination of the information.
So this idea that combining ideas and recombining ideas, this actually goes back to a famous economist, Schumpeter, who I stole or quoted the title of the book, Getting New Things Done. That was just his homespun way of saying innovation is essentially getting new things done. Schumpeter was, again, early 1900s famous economist, and he's probably one of the first people who most visibly coined saying a lot of innovation is not creating things out of whole cloth. It's recombining in different combinations, different pieces that are out there. And then if you take that back to this idea that there's open and closed networks, I'm going to argue that someone in an open network overall, so they have many ties in their network. We're going to take it away from the triad. Just say I have 10 or 75 ties, and I have a higher base rate of open ties, novel people who don't know each other. I'm going to see more novel ideas that I can recombine in creative ways. And then on the process level, if I'm introducing people in collaborative ways and I'm also going to source new knowledge and have a greater locus to be in the mix for how to recombine ideas and come up with the genesis of new ideas, not dramatically new, but just importantly new. So like Schultz didn't invent coffee, but he came back with an espresso. That's arguably some kind of a recombination of something he already did and something new.
And in fact, the recombinant thing is that he did not completely recreate an Italian espresso bar. I will just tell you, Italian espresso bars are weird. People come in, they don't sit down, they stand at tall tables, they are construction workers with their tool belts on and their hats, and they get espressos and they shoot them. They just drink them and go. And they come in groups of 3 and 4, and it's not social in the way that I think of sit around and work on your computer social. And so it wasn't just a reproduction. It was a contextualization. What's interesting about that is that TG is not an attribute of people. In other words, it's a tool that somebody might use. It's a way of engaging with networks. But there are people who might rely more on the Gaudens approach and people who rely more on the Jungian's approach.
That's exactly right. In my sort of research stream, I created a couple measures. So I did that field observation. I created a series of measures through survey work. You could create distinctions about the extent to which they do one or the other. And others since then have come up with even more measures that they elicit from other kinds of data. But there's been some really interesting work that takes us, remember I said that you can do all 3. And I think that's one of the central takeaways here. Are you doing all 3? Connecting at the appropriate time. It's the dominant master skill, but maybe separating. And then also the conduit idea, moving knowledge. But when you start to create, is there a predominant signature for a given individual? There was just a recent study that came out by Eric Quintain, Jungwon Lee, Sunny Lee, Camila Ruiz, and Martin Kildoff. They studied people's distinction between tertius Gauden and tertius Jungians. And they found that people who do that separation orientation, that they burn out quicker and they're more likely to exhibit abusive behavior. Some of this is just the challenge and stress of working a lot across a lot of stovepipes and cross-functionally, but that's a really interesting finding. There's another really interesting work by Raina Brands at University of College London, who studied how stereotypes can create boundaries for women and their potential to achieve success. And so these stereotypes, if a woman engages in the separans behavior, the Gaudens behavior, playing people off one another, they're much more subject to stereotypes of judgment. But if they engage in the connecting work, it's kind of a level playing field. So the good news is there's a way that they can engage that I'm arguing is quite powerful, for which there is no blowback. The bad news, so to speak, is it's not really an advantage per se, but it's one that frees them from the stereotype of what might be applied to women. There's other research that shows about brokers who've been brought into organizations that connect what they refer to as unstigmatized populations to stigmatized populations. This is an initiative to bring people on the spectrum and with autism into the corporation functionally. And brokers were crucial for bridging the gap between those two and helping them both understand each other. There's research that shows that when in senior positions, it can lead to organizational resiliency, more innovative mergers and acquisitions, and even supply chain management. I mean, the field of supply chain management has taken these ideas, separating or joining, into their research in a big way. And kind of here's why. The older version of supply chain was very linear. There's some raw material that goes to one organization that maybe transforms it to a component that gets brought to the next one. But now, because of the world in which you operate, organizations and networks and supply chains are much more dynamic. They could be suppliers in one case and buyers in another. How do we acquire or speak about these very dynamic networks? And so what supply chain management, I mean, dozens of articles have gone into sort of treating not people as the nodes, but organizations as the nodes, and saying to understand what's now happening, we can look at organizations as brokers who in some cases are connectors and in other cases may be playing people off one another, but they're very dynamic and we can use this language and framework to understand it. One example is a Chinese organization called Li & Feng, and they orchestrate networks of designers, retailers, manufacturers, and logistics. And they almost say straight out, we are a broker and we are creating value and acquiring revenue by being that person, that organization, if you will, that's orchestrating. So this even goes up a level to like whole industries and how organizations collaborate.
That's very interesting, the idea that it's fractal, essentially, that you can scale up or scale down. It doesn't have to be 3 people. It can be 3 organizations or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of circle back and loop it, it's just like, so where we started, we talked about individuals have choices to make about how they engage their networks. And part of the answer is do more, not less. Bigger network, not smaller network, but engage as a broker and a connector. Then we went up to level and said bosses or people like Alex who run platforms. There's returns for operating as a connector. And now we've gone up a third level, more meta, if you will, and talked about organizations as nodes and saying there's really opportunities there, especially in the way that our economy and the way we relate to each other is evolving so fast and moving so quickly. There are returns even at that level for acting as an orchestrator that just didn't exist 10, 15 years ago.
One of the graphs that I found so interesting, it wasn't in your book, it was in one of your papers or presentations. It was a graph that showed what kind of connections were most predictive of people being able to move from low income to high income. And there were all these different kinds of connections, and I'm not sure I remember all of them, but the one that really, really mattered, and none of the other ones did, was, do I know people who are wealthy? In other words, it's this connection across monetary scales. I think it was Raj Chetty who created that. So that's a kind of analysis that says not all networks are equally valuable for getting certain things done. And this is one that actually really stands out as making a difference for people in terms of their financial mobility.
There's an assumption on essentially everything that we've talked about so far. And the assumption is Fortune 50-ish. You work for Google. I cut my teeth in a Fortune 50 company. And if you were to look at all management and generally, there's a presumption about where the data comes from. And it looks at people who are in those corporate entities and on average are probably middle class or above. But we know simultaneously that there's enormous amounts of social inequality worldwide. And one of the most interesting findings that came out in the empirical realm was by this economist, Raj Chetty. He studied 70 million Facebook users. And he looked at the extent to which people in the lowest SES, the jargon for that, socioeconomic status, so the lowest quartile of wealth and the highest quartile of wealth. So he did this massive regression and analysis to say what led to economic mobility, put everything in the hopper, very sophisticated methods. And he only got one significant finding. But the significant finding he got was radical and illuminating for a lot of people who are puzzling about these issues. This is your point. He found out that when people in the lowest SES, was called working class, but the lowest quartile of wealth, if they had friends when they were, say, in high school with people in the highest SES, he called that economic connectedness. That was the only variable led to economic mobility across the whole model, which was longitudinal in nature. And this was like the first super high, robust, methodologically finding that said these networks make a difference. And the absence of them can be a huge source of social inequality. So if you take it back home to a more visceral, concrete level, I teach at Cal State Fullerton, and 1/3 of my students are first generation. That means that neither of their parents went to college, graduated from college. 2/3 are from underrepresented minorities. And they have an absence of these ties. And when I used to teach, and still do, the final course they took when they graduate, I kind of noticed a disturbance in the force. I noticed that these seniors not only did not have their jobs lined up, which is sort of the traditional expectation from years back, they weren't even looking for work. And I started to puzzle on this because this is radically different than the elite MBAs I taught at UCI, UC Irvine, and NYU. What's happening here? And I realized part of the story is this idea that they're coming from homes where parents didn't have what I'll call white collar social capital. They weren't at the golf course, country club. They weren't introducing them or pushing them with some instinct about how the game was played. So they were admirably working their butt off by being in school. And by the way, when I say working their butt off, they're also 3/4 of them work. So it's not unusual to see a student who works 40, 45 hours, taking 5 classes to get ahead. But what happens given the absence, first gen parents, underrepresented backgrounds, working full time, is they don't have this social capital. They have no people doing the connecting work. And this turns out to be the currency of the realm about whether they get into what I call career-related jobs. They already have work, so we can't just say they have jobs, but the career-related jobs that are the windows to the future. And so this is why I created something called Social Capital Academy. It kind of goes after that quite explicitly. I can say more about that. I would love to, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
I noticed this problem, and I realized when I started to kind of look into the data out there and the research, this is not just one comprehensive university. Comprehensive is the name for a university. It's not like a research university. And probabilistically, they have more of these first-gen and underrepresented students, though all of these universities, like USC, for an example, would have these same first-gen and underrepresented students. But they're more challenged to access these networks. If we start to say the simple, obvious point, the social capital is crucial to career success, and then by the way that they start structurally, which is where we started our conversation, structurally, they're not accessing those networks. What can you do systematically, programmatically to create those networks? And that's why I created something called Social Capital Academy. And so very briefly, what's social capital? We started during the pandemic, and that was a great thing in the sense that we did it on Zoom, so it's virtual. And so what we did is we mobilized a network of like 100 mentors nationwide. And then we brought primarily Fullerton students in. And over 4 3-hour modules on a Saturday, we build their networks. Social Capital Academy essentially acts as a broker. Think about Chetty and economic connectedness. Now, the thing about Chetty and his findings was the people who excelled and got economic mobility were those that were lucky enough to idiosyncratically have one or more ties to a wealthy friend. But we don't want to sit on our hands and say, well, that's very nice and applaud that. What can we do to implement and orchestrate more of a change along those lines? And the answer is, let's not only introduce them to a wealthy peer, let's introduce them to successful professionals, people they would ordinarily never meet. So this is a social capital problem. And so you could get a student who did everything they were asked to do. They aced all of their classes. They got a 4.0. That's A average for those who don't remember what a GPA is, a grade point average. They could get an ace their classes and they'll graduate with a 4.0 in marketing and will never have met a single professional in marketing. And it's not just about, can we introduce them to that person that can give them the job? It's a question of how their imagination is curtailed. Because if I'm interested in marketing, but I don't know if I want to do big data analysis or social media, and I've never been in conversation with someone in that space, how do I even imagine and select my courses going forward when I'm still 20, 24, 25? So Social Capital Academy helps them work on their story. They have features about their story they don't even realize are beneficial. The fact that they work while they went to school, this very thing we talked about, it is an asset if they know how to present it to employers. The fact that they took care of family where they went to school is multitasking. It's about resilience. So in module 1, we help them reshape a story that goes from adversity to resilience. In module 2, we introduce them to 2 of those professionals they would not have ever ordinarily met. In module 3, we help them practice their story out loud and teach them about networks. And in module 4, we help them build a concrete plan to pursue internships if they're juniors or jobs if they're seniors. And so we're going into this space. We've built it out with several iterations at Fullerton, and now we're talking to several other universities that are potentially adopting. What we like about the model is it's sort of light frame. It doesn't ask too much of the mentors. They're there for 4 weeks typically, and they work in small groups, by the way, and highly structured for those 4, they're Saturdays typically. And then what we're seeing with our empirical results now is that it's transformative. So we see that on measures like career self-efficacy, psychological health, social support, in that 6-week program, 4 modules, the students are actually almost completely transformed in their orientation to their job search.
That's impressive, because I wasn't sure how strong that connection needs to be. For example, do I need to have rich friends? Or is it enough to have rich acquaintances? Well, some of the research you cited earlier is that no, actually acquaintances are really important. It's loose connections are great, right? So I don't need to actually reach the level of deep friendship.
So when Chetty did this really brilliant research, his initial set of recommendations were build schools differently. So the working class kids bump into the wealthier kids. By the time you do the research to validate that, that's like 20 years from now. But if you go in with this lighter framed implementation, there's resources involved. There's the need to mobilize a network and train a network of mentors, which we're getting pretty good at. But you can see how you can go in immediately with something programmatic versus something, let's change the structure 10 years from now, and we can make a big difference.
I can see this happening at different scales. When I was 4th and 5th grade, I lived in Canberra in Australia, and it's a manufactured town. It's a town that was invented to be the capital. Well, one of the things they did is that every neighborhood had, by design, really big expensive houses, medium houses, and really inexpensive houses. And everybody went to the local school, and it was absolutely designed to create that sort of connection across the levels. And this last year, I was in something called the Mira Fellowship, which gives resources and support to people with big world-improving ideas. And one of the people in that was Jack Carey, and he founded something called the Live Oak Wilderness Camp in New Orleans. And it starts at kindergarten. He said, look, there's this real estate in children's lives, which is summer camp, and it's not being adequately leveraged. And he made this as a 12-year program of establishing exactly that kind of capital on maybe a deeper level than is needed. But I can see that it can be done structurally. It's fantastic to see that it can be done programmatically. 4 weeks is not a lot.
Yeah. And so there's an interesting puzzle, and I assume that, a large percentage of your audience, they're business people in one form or another. And there's a question about scaling. Imagine we just said, what's the benefits and virtues of a one-on-one mentorship? There's no doubt that if I were to introduce a student of less resources and wealth, first gen, to a single mentor who was able to meet with them, let's just say weekly, for the next 3 years of their college career, maybe even starting in high school. We know that would be transformative. So full stop, beautiful thing. But when I look at that as half a scholar, an academic, and half a business person, say, that's not going to scale at the level to address the 7 or 10 million students that are suffering from social inequality. So it will not replace an in-depth one-on-one mentor, and we don't have enough of those. But if we could build something else that took the edge off, so that in that 4-module sequence, and I'm asking 4 Saturdays from the mentor volunteers, that we can take the edge off and transform their sense of what they can create, how to engage their networks. They leave tied to these people on LinkedIn, usually. Then you have a model for scaling. And that's the argument we're making to certain funding sources, is that other stuff is really powerful. But we also want to ask the question, where in the mix are we building implementations that we can scale? And our hope is that we can do this at scale.
That's fantastic. I'm just going to summarize what this all means to me, which is, I think to somebody listening, so much of my professional practice has been brokerage. The last 15 years of my career was brokering. That's what it was. I didn't have a way to think of it. And so it was largely improvisational is the best word. Seeing that there's this around it, and seeing that it's also, this practice has been around a long time. It's weird that I know so little about it. I have a few closing questions. The first one's weird, and I don't think I prepared you for it. A lot of this show is about the design of work. So I ask product-like questions about work. And the first one is, what do you hire your job to do for you?
Well, let's just call this hopeful, a hopeful answer. Like, what could the university do? And then every organization probably gets some mixed grades. But a university and an organization is related to my context. They can be supportive with respect to resources. They can be supportive to create a platform to experiment and try and create innovations. That's the big story for someone who's in the innovation space. They can create, like we said, an envelope that makes easier to broker. So brokering is a noble and potentially heroic act. It's something that sometimes our people are deeply driven to do. I suspect that that's true for you, Dart. But I think at the same time, and you know this probably because you work within a large organization, there are days and divisions where you feel more support to do what you do and reach its full potential. And other days where you feel, boy, I feel like I'm getting blocked at every step. So I would say hire a university to support you in brokering, supporting you to do creative research, and cut you slack so that if they recognize the value of what you're creating, create as much support as possible to create those innovations.
It's a nice summary. And what I like about it is the reference to your place of work as a platform, which is that it's a platform that is itself a broker for you, right? Which is it's bringing you together with students who you would not otherwise have access with. It's bringing you together with grants potentially, and it might be bringing you together with places you can publish potentially. And that these are all things that give you that ability to make a difference. That's really powerful.
I find this interesting, this idea of how did you frame that question? I mean, I understood it, but just how do you say it when you ask that question?
The background of this is, what job do you hire blank to do for you? And it's a marketing question. So the reason for it is that if I was designing a drill and I said, how should I design this power drill for you? You'd say, well, it needs to have a handle, it needs to have a trigger, and you'd start describing every drill that you've ever seen. But if I ask you what job you want the drill to do for you, you'll say, I want it to make a hole in things. And so if I made a drill for you that had a trigger but didn't make holes, it wouldn't work for you. But if I made one that made holes and didn't have the little trigger, it would work great. And so it's a question that you ask so that you can design something that is not just a faster horse, to quote Ford, but is actually solving the problem that you want to solve with your work.
So I love the question. I love how it puts you in a different space. But it strikes me as I'm listening to that question that some percentage of your people are entrepreneurs and startups, whether they're nonprofit and social entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs. And they don't have the benefit of hiring an organization And so I think the interesting shift on that, and I'm curious what you think about this, would be you've got to sort of engineer the platform, if you will, and the context that's supportive for you. So the organization could either be brilliant or deficient, and that's the attritional employment relationship. I know you're all over this about how work's evolving. So when someone's an entrepreneur, it's sort of on them to create, and this goes to maybe a little bit of that connecting work, creating and orchestrating, maybe even more than feels efficient, but necessary to create an envelope of social support, an envelope of resources, a network that the organizations, there is no organization, there's no they're there to support. They've got to create it themselves. How do you puzzle on that? If you don't mind me shifting and ask, how do you translate that for an entrepreneur?
So sometimes I say job and sometimes I say work. So what do you hire your work to do for you? But I will tell you that the second question I ask along with that one is, what does your job cost you? And I'll ask you that in a second. But I'll tell you that entrepreneurs are the ones most likely to say, my job costs me very little. In other words, there's very little overhead. And I will tell you, because I am starting a company called Obstfeld, and a part of what you have the ability to do is you get to be very selective about what work you take, because it's not a company that's deciding what work you take. You decide what work you take. And you have the ability to assemble a team that loves to do the things you hate to do. And so there's somebody on my team who loves to organize other people. I don't love to do that. There's somebody on the team who loves to coach others. I don't like to do that. And so the answer is, entrepreneurs have a lot more control over the design of their work experience than you find inside companies.
I agree with that up until a point. I'll do sort of a partial pushback to say, in the way you described your entrepreneurial startup, which sounds impressive and interesting, but you're obviously starting with some reservoir of resources and reputation. And if you have a traditional entrepreneur that is going to live or die based on cash flow, and then what's free is also very expensive because it's all on the rails of energy and time until they create some traction. And so that can be, I think the cost is, and I think that's the answer to the cost question. And I'm somewhat involved in a startup here because I'm making appeals to foundations now and trying to, my reputation as a researcher has to be translated to someone who could potentially build an organization. And that's a translation that needs to be made. That's all in the fold of what we talked about in terms of knowledge articulation. But until you've got a groundswell of resources where you can hire those people either on a contract basis or full time, then a lot of the cost is the resources and energy that you expend till you get that traction. And that could be one answer that an entrepreneur, traditional entrepreneur might say, is the cost to me is I love what I'm doing. I have a vision of what I want to create. And on some Saturdays and Sundays and Thursdays, I'm pretty tired.
They do say that. They do say that. It depends on where they are in their career. Some will say it costs them family. Some will say costs them money. In other words, people make these massive outlays up front. I asked one person recently, what does your job cost me? She said, literally $2 million a year of outlay.
Yeah, I mean, we laugh, but there's tears there as well. So,
yeah. And I will just tell you let me just tell you, this is so interesting, which is who is working for my company? It's people who are attracted to the message that comes through this podcast. So in other words, it's like this beacon, and there are certain people who are passionate enough and are different from me who are attracted to doing work that supports the mission of this. So it's fascinating.
So just to be a little bit of a one-trick pony, I will say, again, that as a podcaster, you're a broker. You're connecting ideas from different interesting people out into the world. We'll call that project one. And then project two is this now startup. And now you've assembled amongst that large audience base, some that are particularly interested in your mission and vision. And you're going to be Dart 2.0 or probably 7.0. And you're going to connect this new startup, which is about orchestrating, pulling together in some kind of working organization, which is not fully defined yet. And that's as it should be, your next project. And you'll be the Tertius connecting all these people and figuring out where you're going to generate revenue. And that's all like exactly as it should be. And that's generating innovation and creating value.
It's exactly right. You describe my life. You have a language. It's absolutely
and
true.
Brokering this to everybody, and they know this, but brokering is full of energy. And as we said, it can be exhausting. And I'm sure on some Thursdays and Saturdays, you feel both.
Absolutely right. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I found your work absolutely fascinating, as I think you can probably hear in my voice. Very, very interesting work, very interesting book.
Well, Dart, I really enjoyed it. It's just been a great conversation. And I think I'm accurate in saying I don't think in an interview I've ever been asked about the actual terminology I use. And I generally, as a rule, don't even bring up this idea of the tertius. So anyone who's listening, I don't usually bring up tertius young gains or tertius gaudens. But you, my friend, you read the book, you understood the book, you asked me these really good and incisive questions. And so it's just been a great experience for me to kind of go a deeper level, but also tie it back to practical issues that we're all contending with.
Thank you. And I will tell you that I have a really smart audience. Why? Because all the other ones left. I mean, it's sort of like, no, it's a great group of listeners. So where can people learn more about you and your work?
I have two websites. One is, per our last domain of conversation, socialcapitalacademy.org. And you can find out about Social Capital Academy, and also there's ways to reach me. And then there's a second one, which is David Obstfeld, PhD, because David Obstfeld was taken. So it's davidobstfeldphd.com. And that would be sort of more of a summary of the kind of social network research that we're discussing. I'll just do sort of one final messaging out to anyone who's still listening towards the end of this podcast, which is to say, we're actively recruiting. We're running a Social Capital Academy as we speak. We won't do one until the spring, but we're building out a network. So we have like essentially 30 volunteers from Johnson & Johnson who re-up all the time, and we're expanding there. Ernst & Young, Disney, and we're looking for the mentors that would participate on this limited basis. One, and I'm going to go a little bit more detail and then we'll be done, but I'll say one version of our mentors stay with the students all 4 modules. So that's 4 Saturdays, 2 weeks apart. But there's a second kind of mentor, which is called a career expert, that only comes in for module 2, 1 Saturday for 2 hours, and they would be an expert in marketing or civil engineering. So there's 2 different ways to kind of volunteer. What's in it for the mentors is it's not this long sustained commitment to the student, even though there's a tremendous amount of caring here. The mentors come back because there's such vibrancy and realness in being with these students who are excited, but don't know how quite to make the next move. So if you're interested, or you know of sources of funding that might be interested, either people individually want to invest or people who know foundations in the education space, they should reach out to me. And I'll say my email address is dobstfeld@fullerton.edu. So D in my last name, OBSTFELD @fullerton.edu. Would love to get messages from anyone who's just interested in the work, or alternatively think they may be interested in Social Capital Academy.
If I want to participate, do I need to be physically close to Fullerton, or is this something that can be done online?
No, that's the perfect question to end on. The definition of Social Capital Academy, and I actually will make this way, the definition is it's a virtual program. So we have people from Toronto, Chicago, Washington, D.C., even in Europe, who come in for these 2 or 3 hour windows to participate. And I think the secret sauce, this is going to play back into the fold of what you talk about. I think the secret sauce is virtual and synchronous. I don't think these students can stick the landing with AI or asynchronous websites. There's value to be derived. But what we deliver is this synchronous engagement, but not to your point, Dart. You don't need to be in Fullerton in person at all. You can show up in the comfort of your office or your living room, and you can show up for those few hours on Zoom, and then you're done, and you haven't spent a penny on gasoline.
Sounds easy and fun. So, thank you. That's fantastic. I'll do it. Just so you know, I'll sign up.
All right, Dart. We'll definitely reach out to you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And Share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.